Imagine you're missing, not just lost, but vanished. And then 8 years later you're found not in the forest, not at the bottom of a lake, but in an abandoned mine welded shut from the inside. You're sitting, leaning against the wall next to your loved one. It looks like you simply fell asleep, but you're dead and your leg bones are broken. This isn't a story about movie monsters. This is the true story of Sarah and Andrew. It's a story about how a 3-day trip to the Mojave Desert turned into an 8-year mystery, whose answer proved more terrifying than anyone could imagine. This story began in 2010. Sarah and Andrew were an ordinary couple from Las Vegas. She was 26, he was 28. They weren't extreme sports enthusiasts or experienced survivalists. They were just two people who loved each other and wanted to spend a weekend away from the city. Their plan was as simple as possible. Take their old but reliable car, drive to the desert lands of the Mojave, set up a tent there for 3 days and 2 nights, take photos of the landscape, and simply be together. They chose a specific location not far from an area where uranium was actively mined in the middle of the last century. Now all that remains there are abandoned mines, rusted equipment and roads that have long disappeared from official maps. For them, it was just exotic, an opportunity to see something unusual and take unique photos. They weren't looking for adventure, much less trouble. Before leaving on Friday morning, Sarah wrote a message to her sister. "We're leaving. We'll be back Sunday night. Love you." That was the last message any of their loved ones received. They packed water, food, a tent, sleeping bags, the standard tourist kit. They didn't take any special equipment for exploring mines or anything like that, because they had no intention of doing so. They were only interested in the surface, only in the desert views at sunset. The weekend passed, Sunday night came. Sarah and Andrew didn't return. At first, no one panicked. Well, maybe they were delayed. Maybe there was bad signal somewhere. These things happen. But when both failed to show up for work on Monday, their relatives sounded the alarm. Calls to their phones went straight to voicemail. Friends they had been in contact with confirmed they had gone to the Mojave, to the area of the old mines. The family immediately contacted police, and a search operation was organized that same day. At first, everyone was hopeful. Police, volunteers, dozens of people scoured the area. The desert in the Mojave is a huge, almost infinite space. Canyons, rocks, dry riverbeds. Finding 2 people here is like looking for a needle in a haystack. Searchers in cars and ATVs checked all known and abandoned roads. A helicopter was sent, circling the area for hours, trying to spot any sign. A car, a tent, a campfire. But days passed and there were no clues, none at all. No one had seen their car. No one had encountered a couple like them. It was as if they had vanished into thin air as soon as they left their city. Hope began to fade with each passing day. The desert climate doesn't forgive mistakes. During the day, the heat was unbearable, and at night it was cold. If they ran out of water or simply got lost, their chances of survival were diminishing every hour. Police began to consider other possibilities. Maybe they never made it to the Mojave. Maybe they decided to run away and start a new life. But this theory was quickly discarded. Their bank accounts were untouched. Their credit cards hadn't been used. They left their pets at home and asked a neighbor to take care of them. People who plan to disappear forever don't do that. The criminal theory also seemed unlikely. There was almost no one in the area. It was the middle of nowhere. The probability of a random attack was extremely low. The search continued for almost a week. Volunteers and family members didn't give up, but police were already preparing to end the active phase of the operation. And then, on the 7th day, when hope was almost exhausted, a helicopter pilot noticed a glint in the sun. It wasn't just a glint, it was flashing lights. Sarah and Andrew's car was found. It was parked on one of those abandoned roads that were barely visible on the ground. The road led toward the old uranium mines and ended after a few miles. The car was in the middle of the trail, as if it had simply been abandoned. The first thing that caught the attention of the group that arrived at the scene were the emergency lights. The battery was almost dead, and the lights were flashing weakly. It was strange. Emergency lights are turned on when there's a breakdown or stop. This meant that when the car stopped, Sarah and Andrew were beside it. Police inspected the car. There were no signs of break-in, no accident damage. The doors were unlocked. Inside, everything looked as if the owners had stepped away for a few minutes. There was a map of the area on the passenger seat next to an empty water bottle. Andrew's phone was found in the glove compartment. Experts later confirmed there were no missed calls on it, no attempts to call emergency services or anyone close. The battery was more than half charged. But the most important discovery was the navigation system. It was on, and the screen showed a route that led further down this deserted road to one of the old mines. This discovery gave hope and raised even more questions. Why didn't they call? Maybe there simply wasn't cell signal in the area, and they knew it. But then, why was the car abandoned? Police checked the tank. It was completely empty. This explained why they stopped. They simply ran out of gas. They turned on the emergency lights to stay visible. This made sense. But where did they go after that? And why was the navigator pointing to a specific mine? Maybe they hoped to find help there or shelter from the sun. The search team, encouraged by the discovery, immediately set off along the route indicated by the navigator. They walked along a barely visible trail, burned by the sun. There wasn't a soul around, just the wind and the echoing silence of the desert. After a few miles, they reached the destination. It was the entrance to an old uranium mine. A common descent, nothing notable in the rock, filled with rusted junk and old boards. The entrance was narrow, but it was possible for a person to pass through. The searchers cautiously examined everything around, but found nothing. No tracks, no belongings, no sign that people had been there recently. The wind and sand in recent days could have covered any footprints. The rescuers shouted their names several times into the darkness of the mine, but there was only silence in response. Going deeper without special equipment was deadly dangerous. Old mines are labyrinths where a collapse can happen at any moment, or you can be poisoned by accumulated gases. A search of the surrounding area also yielded nothing. They scoured every meter within a radius of several miles from the car and the mine entrance. No tent, no sleeping bags, no campfire, nothing at all. It was inexplicable. If they ran out of gas, it would have been logical to set up camp right next to the car and wait for help. Or if they went looking for help, they would have taken at least some things with them, like water. But all their basic equipment, the tent, sleeping bags, food supplies, simply disappeared, just like Sarah and Andrew themselves. After this discovery, the active search continued for several more days, but in vain. Police couldn't send people into the depths of the unstable mine without direct evidence that the couple was inside. It would be an unjustified risk. Gradually, the search operation was ended. Sarah and Andrew's case was classified as a disappearance. Their photos were put on bulletin boards and written about in local newspapers. Their families hired private investigators, but even they couldn't find new clues. Months passed, then years. The story of Sarah and Andrew became one of those dark legends told around campfires. A mystery covered by desert dust. It seemed no one would ever know the answer to the question of what had happened to them. The car with an empty tank and the navigator pointing to a dark hole in the rock remained the only silent witnesses to their last journey. And for 8 long years, complete and absolute silence reigned in this case. 8 years passed. For most people, the story of Sarah and Andrew became just another unsolved mystery, a sad reminder of how dangerous nature can be. The families continued to live with an unhealed wound, without answers, and without even the opportunity to bury their loved ones. The case gathered dust in the files under the label "Cold Case," and so it would have remained if not for 2 local residents who in 2018 decided to earn some extra money collecting scrap metal. These guys weren't detectives or adventurers. They simply knew there was a lot of abandoned equipment left in the area of the old uranium mines that could be cut up and sold. On a hot autumn day, they drove their old pickup truck along the same forgotten roads where the missing couple's car had once been found. Their destination was the same mine that Andrew's navigator had pointed to, not because they knew this detail, but simply because it was a large location where they hoped to find a lot of metal. When they approached the entrance, they saw the same thing the searchers had seen 8 years ago, a hole in the rock filled with debris. But something was wrong. The entrance, which had previously been simply filled with trash, now appeared sealed. Someone had dragged a large rusted sheet of thick metal there and somehow secured it, piling rocks and beams on top. It was strange. Normally mines are left open or sealed with concrete and warning signs placed. This looked like someone had hastily but very securely tried to hide something or prevent someone from entering. For the metal hunters, this sheet itself was a prize. They brought a gas torch with them. They spent several hours in the heat, cutting a passage in the sheet large enough to crawl through. When they finally finished, the opening emitted musty, cold, and completely still air. The kind of air that only exists in places that have been sealed for many years. One of the men shined a powerful flashlight inside. At first, the beam revealed only bare stone walls covered with dust and a floor covered with small rocks. The shaft went straight into the rock. He moved the beam further, peering into the darkness, and then the light stopped at the back of this small first chamber. About 50 feet from the entrance were two figures. They were just sitting on the ground, leaning their backs against the wall, their heads slightly bowed. They were sitting very close to each other. The man with the flashlight didn't understand what he was seeing at first. Maybe they were mannequins or some kind of trash that looked like people from a distance. He called to his partner. His partner also looked inside and froze. Both looked silently into the darkness, and then one of them said quietly, "Those are people." There was no panic, just shock. The poses were too calm. There was no blood, no sign of struggle. Just two people who seemed to have sat down to rest in the cool air and fallen asleep. But both understood that people don't sleep in a sealed mine. They immediately drove several miles until they got cell signal and called police. The news of the discovery in the old mine shook the entire state. The police officers who had worked on Sarah and Andrew's case 8 years ago immediately understood what place they were talking about. A team of investigators and forensic specialists were sent to the scene. It was difficult to work inside. The air was stale, and the place itself was oppressive in its silence. The scene they saw was exactly as the metal hunters had described. Two people, a man and a woman, sitting leaning against the wall. Their clothes, common hiking clothes, were deteriorated by age but not torn. There were no personal belongings around them. No backpack, no water, nothing. Just bare rock and dust. The bodies were heavily mummified due to the dry air in the mine, which had preserved them in this position. Sarah and Andrew's families were informed of the terrible discovery, and soon DNA analysis confirmed what everyone already knew. It was them. The 8-year search was over. The mystery of their whereabouts had been solved. But from that moment, a new, even more terrifying mystery began. What had happened to them inside that mine? The investigation began with a detailed examination of the scene and the bodies, and immediately a series of oddities emerged that didn't fit any logical explanation. First, there were no injuries on the bodies or clothes that indicated an attack. No cuts, no bullet wounds, no signs of struggle. Second, the scene itself. They were sitting calmly. It didn't look like they were panicking, trying to get out or calling for help. They were just sitting there. But the most important and shocking fact was established by the medical examiner during the autopsy. Both Sarah and Andrew had broken bones in their legs, multiple fractures of the shins and feet. These were serious injuries that couldn't have occurred on their own. Such injuries are sustained when falling from a great height. But how did this fit with the absence of other injuries and their calm posture? And then, investigators noticed the structure of the mine itself. The passage the metal hunters had opened was horizontal, but above the place where Sarah and Andrew were sitting there was another hole in the ceiling, a vertical shaft leading somewhere up toward the surface. A new theory began to emerge, and it was terrifying. Sarah and Andrew didn't enter the mine through the side entrance. They fell into it. They fell through the vertical shaft itself that was possibly hidden by bushes or boards on the surface. They fell several meters and landed on the stone floor, breaking their legs. They were alive, but immobilized. They couldn't get up, couldn't go anywhere. They were trapped. But this theory only explained the injuries. It didn't explain the main thing: who sealed the side exit and why. Investigators carefully examined the metal sheet itself that sealed the entrance. The examination showed it had been welded to the rock using professional welding equipment. Moreover, the welding method indicated it had been done from inside. But no equipment was found inside the mine. No welding machine, no generator, not even a simple hammer. Nothing. It was impossible. Someone entered the mine, welded the only exit from inside, and then simply disappeared without leaving any tools behind. The absence of signs of struggle now seemed even more sinister. If they had been attacked, they would have reacted, but if they had fallen and broken their legs, they were completely defenseless. Anyone who found them in this condition could have done anything to them. And someone did. Someone found them injured and helpless, and, instead of helping them, this person decided to bury them alive. He or they dragged a metal sheet to the side exit, welded it shut, condemning Sarah and Andrew to a slow death in complete darkness from hunger and thirst. The thought was so monstrous it was hard to believe. This wasn't just negligence or an accident. It was cold, cruel murder that lasted for days. Police realized they weren't looking for just any random criminal. They were looking for someone who knew the area well, someone who knew about the existence of this mine, knew about the vertical descent and the side exit. Maybe he himself had set the trap on the surface they fell into and knew how to cover his tracks and leave unnoticed, perhaps through some other narrow crevice or ventilation shaft known only to him. The case went from being a cold case to the highest priority investigation. Now police had a goal: find the monster who had turned the old mine into a tomb for 2 innocent people. And this monster was still out there, somewhere. Police worked the case for 2 years. The list of suspects was very short. Who could have known so much about these mines? Who could have had welding equipment and the skills to use it in such a remote area? Investigators began to do what they should have done in 2010. They began to dig up all the ownership and lease records for these abandoned lands. Most of the mines don't belong to anyone, but some lots, including the one where Sarah and Andrew died, were on long-term lease to a private individual. It was a man in his 60s who lived alone on a small ranch a few dozen miles away. He had been leasing the land for many years, ostensibly for geological research, though he didn't actually conduct any real activity there. Neighbors described him as antisocial and reclusive, who didn't like it when anyone showed up on his property. He had repeatedly gotten into conflicts with tourists or hunters who accidentally wandered onto his land. For police, this was the first real lead they'd had in all this time. They obtained a search warrant for his house and property. The man himself, the owner of the leased property, received police without surprise, but with barely disguised hostility. He denied everything, saying he knew nothing about missing tourists and hadn't been in the area of that mine for many years. But during a search of his workshop, investigators found something that silenced him. Hanging on a nail among a pile of old tools was a key ring. These were keys to the old locks on gates that blocked some of the entrances to the mines, and in a desk drawer, under a pile of old bills, was a yellowed sheet of paper rolled into a tube. It wasn't just a map of the area, it was a detailed diagram of the internal passages of several mines, including that one. The diagram marked not only the main entrance and vertical shaft, but also several narrow ventilation tunnels that not even the Mine Supervision Service knew about. One of these tunnels led to the surface almost a mile from the main entrance. This was the answer to the question of how the killer could have disappeared after sealing the exit from inside. He had his own secret exit. When shown this diagram, the man realized it was useless to deny and spoke. But it wasn't remorse. He told his version of events dryly and without emotion. That day he was patrolling his territory and heard screams. He followed the sound and found two people in the mine. They had fallen into an old shaft that he himself had once covered with rotten boards to keep animals out. He saw they were alive but injured. They were on his land, strangers, trespassers. In his twisted mind, they weren't victims, but a problem. He didn't speak to them, he just walked away silently. He returned to his ranch, got a welding machine and generator, loaded everything into his pickup, and drove to the side entrance of the mine. He didn't consider himself killing them. In his logic, he was simply protecting his property. He welded the exit so strangers wouldn't climb up anymore where they shouldn't. He admitted he blocked the entrance, but denied murder to the end, insisting they were to blame because they trespassed on his property. He simply locked the door behind the trespassers. The fact that two injured people were dying in darkness and agony behind that door didn't seem to bother him. The trial wasn't long. There was more than enough evidence. Prosecutors didn't bring a direct charge of intentional murder. It was difficult to prove he wanted them to die. The official version, as stated in the verdict, was as follows: intentional abandonment in danger resulting in the death of two people. For finding Sarah and Andrew injured, and instead of helping them, condemning them to a painful death by sealing them in a stone bag, he received 18 years in prison. The mystery that had tormented everyone for almost 10 years was solved. Behind this terrible and inexplicable disappearance were neither mystical forces of the desert nor serial killers from movies. There was just one person. A person whose paranoid hatred of strangers proved stronger than common human compassion. The story of Sarah and Andrew didn't end the day they disappeared, and not even the day their bodies were found. It ended the moment justice named the person who left them to die in the cold darkness of an abandoned mine.